Dust billowed in lazy clouds, clinging to the sweat and souls of the men standing before the ranch's main house. On one side stood Franklin Spencer, a man forged by the Texas sun, whose thick hands knew the grip of a plow and the trigger of a rifle better than the touch of paper. His eyes, the color of the sky before a storm, were fixed on the man before him. On the other, Harrison Douglas, dressed with a polish that insulted the rustic landscape. He carried no rifle, but a thin smile and a rolled document, a far more dangerous weapon in these new times. At his side, henchmen with low-slung holsters ensured the conversation wouldn't stray into the field of honor, but remain in the realm of force. This paper, signed under the old Spanish grant, nullifies any title you possess, Spencer, Harrison said, his voice as soft as a serpent's. This land, the water that flows through it, it all belongs to my development company. Franklin spat on the ground. This land has my father's blood, who defended it when Texas was still a dream. No paper signed by a dead king is worth more than that. He glanced aside where his son, Wyatt Kendrick Hughes, watched the scene with a calm Franklin mistook for weakness. "Wyatt, get the rifle. No one takes what is ours." But Wyatt didn't move. His eyes were not on the henchman, but on the paper in Harrison's hands. He saw the details, the ink, the texture. He felt the trap. "Pa, wait," he said, his voice steady but low. "This is what he wants, a confrontation. If we shoot, we'll be outlaws. Let me see the document." Harrison Douglas let out a mocking laugh. "The boy has brains, or maybe just fear." The word fear hit Franklin like a punch. He turned to his son, disappointment twisting his face into a mask of fury. In front of his men, in front of the enemy stealing his legacy, his own blood hesitated. "Coward," Franklin growled, the word laden with the weight of a lifetime of broken expectations. "My father fought at San Jacinto, and I raised a son who fears a piece of paper. Get out of my sight." The humiliation was public cutting. Wyatt felt everyone's gaze upon him, his father's contempt burning hotter than the midday sun. He took a step back, not out of fear, but to contain the storm brewing within him. He saw the full picture. Harrison didn't just want the land, he wanted it cleanly, legalized by the violence of its very owners. A small memory flashed in his mind, a flashback from years ago. He, a boy, watching his father settle a fence dispute with a neighbor. Franklin hadn't argued. He'd simply smashed down the other man's fence with a sledgehammer. It worked, but the neighbor never looked him in the eye again. Wyatt learned that day that brute force solved the now, but intelligence secured tomorrow. Now, as Harrison Douglas ordered his men to begin driving new stakes into Spencerland, Franklin felt like a deposed king in his own kingdom, looking at his son as the personification of his defeat. The old farmer sat on the porch, a broken man, as the sound of the enemy's hammers beat out the end of his world. He didn't see when Wyatt, his face impassive, mounted his horse and rode off, not towards town for help, but into the open desert, into the silence where plans are born. His father called him a coward. The world called him weak. But in the silence of that humiliation, a plan began to take shape, one that neither gunpowder nor steel could stop. The days that followed were a slow agony. For Franklin Spencer, Harrison Douglas wasted no time. He blocked access to the creek that served not only the Spencer Ranch, but all the small neighboring properties, strangling the community's life with bureaucratic possession. Franklin, once a pillar of the region, was now seen as a stubborn old man who lost everything out of pride, and guilt, like a vulture, hovered over Wyatt's absence. "Your son ran away," the neighbors said, some with pity, others with contempt. He left his father alone to face ruin. Inside the big house, the silence was heavy. Franklin looked at the rifle above the fireplace, the weapon Wyatt refused to take, and saw in it the symbol of a broken lineage. He didn't understand his son's world, a world of books and thoughts, a world he considered fragile and useless against life's harshness. Meanwhile, Wyatt wasn't running. He was riding. By day, he observed the movements on the ranch from a distance, mapping the routine of Harrison's men, noting who came and went. At night, he didn't sleep. Bent over a makeshift table in an abandoned cabin, he studied old maps, copies of territorial laws he'd managed to get from an old clerk in the next town. He knew brute force was a dead end. Harrison Douglas's weakness wasn't in his goons, but in his arrogance, in the belief that his lie was perfect. The humiliation he suffered at his father's hands hadn't broken him. It had forged a cold determination within him. He was no longer fighting for the land, but for the truth. A flashback assaulted him one lonely night. His grandfather on his deathbed had given him a book of laws, not a rifle. "Your father knows how to take land, my grandson," the old man had said. "You need to learn how to keep it. Texas was won with blood, but it will be kept with wisdom. Remember men like Crockett. He was a great shot, yes, but it was his mind and his voice that took him to Congress. A man who only knows how to shoot is a tool. A man who knows why he shoots is a leader." The memory strengthened his conviction. The injustice deepened when Harrison threw a party at the Spencer Ranch, inviting politicians and investors from Austin. Music and laughter echoed through the valley, a mockery of Franklin's pain, who watched the lights of his own home, now a stranger in his own life. Harrison, drunk with power, toasted to progress and the end of old traditions that hold Texas to the past. It was a direct attack on men like Franklin. Wyatt, hidden in the shadows of the hills, observed every important face that arrived. He felt no hatred, but a chilling clarity. He needed irrefutable proof, something that would crumble Harrison's house of cards at once. His greatest obstacle was time. The neighbors, desperate from the lack of water, were beginning to sell their lands to Harrison for a pittance. The community was falling apart. In his search, he found a clue, a name on an old land registry appearing as a witness in several concessions of that era. A surveyor who worked for the Mexican government before the Revolution. His signature was not on Harrison's document. It was a small crack in the armor, but it was enough. In the silence of the abandoned barn that had become his headquarters, amidst the smell of old hay and cold gunpowder, an idea began to take shape, an audacious plan that depended not on a confrontation, but on a revelation. Harrison Douglas's power was written in paper and ink, but the truth of Texas was written on the land, and Wyatt was about to learn to read. Wyatt's hunt for the truth led him to places his father would never have set foot. Dusty archives, old churches that held baptismal and property records, and conversations with elders whose memories predated official maps. He acted in secret, moving like a ghost on the fringes of the society that had judged him. It was on one of these searches that he found an unexpected ally. Charlotte Rogers Morrison was a woman whose strength lay not in a loud voice, but in the steadfastness of her gaze. Her family had been among the first expelled by Harrison Douglas using a similar legal maneuver. She ran a small printing press in town, and her hatred for the businessman was as deep and silent as Wyatt's determination. "They call you a coward because you wouldn't pick up a gun," she told Wyatt when he went to her print shop seeking information about Spanish-era paper and ink types. They don't understand you're fighting a different war, with weapons they don't even know exist. Charlotte not only believed him, she had what he needed. Her grandfather, a meticulous clerk, had kept copies of dozens of documents from that era, including one that contained the authentic signature of the surveyor Wyatt was looking for. Comparing it to Harrison's document, the forgery became obvious to anyone who knew where to look. It was his first small victory, a spark of hope. Together, they began to assemble the puzzle. Wyatt brought the maps and Laws, and Charlotte, with her knowledge of printing and documents, identified the anomalies. They discovered that the seal on Harrison's document was of a type used years after the date on the paper. It was proof, but still circumstantial. They needed something irrefutable, something that couldn't be contested by expensive lawyers. The key, Wyatt realized, wasn't to prove Harrison's document was fake, but to prove which one was real. He remembered his grandfather's stories about the early Texas surveyors, men who mapped the wild territory with chains and theodolites, and one name kept recurring, a man whose reputation for honesty was as legendary as his skill with a rifle, Davy Crockett. Before his fateful journey to the Alamo, Crockett, in his time as a congressman, had taken a deep interest in the land disputes plaguing the settlers. He knew that land ownership was the foundation of freedom. Wyatt discovered, through an old letter in Charlotte's archives, that Crockett had commissioned a new topographical survey of the region concerned precisely with frauds based on old, confused Spanish grants. Where would this map be? Could this be the final proof? The search for Crockett's map became an obsession. The trail led them to an old retired missionary who lived reclusively in the hills. The man, a friend of Crockett's, confirmed the existence of the map. Davy was a man ahead of his time, the old man said. He knew that future wars in Texas wouldn't just be fought with cannons, but with deeds and laws. He registered the original map, not in local archives, which could be corrupted, but with military authority, as a strategic security document. Wyatt's plan was almost complete. He had the proof of forgery, and now he had the path to the proof of truth. Only one piece was missing: to force a public confrontation where Harrison Douglas couldn't use his influence to escape. The opportunity arose when Harrison announced a grand auction to sell the water rights of the Spencer Ranch. It would be a public event with the presence of the state's entire elite. It would be the perfect stage. As Harrison Douglas slept dreaming of empires, the young man he despised rode towards the past, carrying the only weapon the villain couldn't buy: truth. And he didn't know it, but he was riding to meet a legend. The day of the auction dawned bright and merciless, the Texas sun cooking the land at the heart of the dispute. The Austin elite arrived in carriages, the men in their expensive hats, and the women with their fans, all ready to witness and profit from Harrison Douglas's consolidation of power. He had set up a platform in front of the Spencer Ranch house, the same place where Franklin had been humiliated. The old farmer was there in the crowd, not by his own will, but dragged by a masochistic need to witness the end of his legacy. His shoulders were stooped, the fire in his eyes now mere embers. Harrison climbed onto the platform, radiant. He began his speech, talking of the future, of progress, of how the old guard of stubborn farmers stood in the way of prosperity. He held up the forged document. This is the law. This is the foundation of our future. The auctioneer was about to begin the bidding when a lone rider emerged on the horizon, riding slowly, unhurried. It was Wyatt. The crowd murmured. Harrison smiled a smile of contempt. Look at that. The cowardly son is back to watch the burial. But Wyatt wasn't alone. Behind him, riding with the same imposing calm, came another figure, an older man with a raccoon coat and a gaze that seemed to carry the entire history of Texas. Silence fell over the crowd like a shroud. Franklin Spencer lifted his eyes, and his heart leaped. He knew that face from engravings, from legends told around the campfire. It was Davy Crockett. Crockett wasn't there by chance. Wyatt had found him in the neighboring town, where the legendary frontiersman was visiting old war comrades. Wyatt hadn't asked him to fight. He simply presented the evidence he had gathered, appealing not to the warrior, but to the legislator, the man of law. Crockett, whose hatred for land speculators was notorious, listened intently, and seeing the truth in the young man's meticulous plan, agreed to be his witness. Harrison Douglas paled. Crockett's name carried more weight in Texas than any judge or politician. Crockett dismounted, walked to the platform, and stood beside Wyatt, saying nothing. Wyatt addressed the crowd, his voice clear and firm, without a trace of fear. This man, Harrison Douglas, speaks of the law. So let's talk about the law. He, with the help of Charlotte, who stepped forward with a folder of documents, began to dismantle the lie. He showed the forged signature, pointed out the anomaly in the seal, explained how the paper type didn't exist on the alleged date. Harrison's confidence began to crumble. He stammered, calling Wyatt a liar, desperate. It was then that Crockett spoke, his voice resonating with an authority no one dared to challenge. "A man can forge a paper," he said, pulling a large leather roll from his saddle, "but he cannot forge the land itself." He unfurled the map. It was the original topographical survey of the region with his name and seal. This map, registered with the Texas Army, shows the real landmarks and boundaries, established to protect settlers from vultures like you, Douglas. The creek's source was never on the grant you claim to own. It always belonged to this property. The final blow was devastating. Crockett pointed to Harrison's document. And furthermore, the only reason a man like me would take the trouble to make such a detailed map was because the original surveyor, whose name you forged, was found dead weeks after refusing to sell his integrity to San Antonio speculators. The implication was clear. Harrison's fraud was stained with blood. The local sheriff, who had conveniently stayed out of the way until then, saw which way the wind was blowing. With Crockett's tacit support and the furious gaze of the crowd, he climbed onto the platform and arrested Harrison Douglas, who was now trembling, his arrogance shattered. Crockett then turned to Franklin Spencer. "Mr. Spencer," he said in a respectful tone, "a man who rushes to violence when he can use reason risks everything. A man who uses his head to protect his inheritance is not a coward. He is a strategist. He is the kind of man who builds a nation. You should be proud." That day, not a single shot was fired on the Spencer Ranch. Justice arrived not with the sound of a gunshot, but in the silence of a map being unfurled. And as the sun set, a father looked at his son and for the first time saw the man he truly was. The dust settled, literally and figuratively. The Spencer Ranch returned to the hands of its rightful owner, and Harrison Douglas was taken to Austin to face a trial that, without his fortune and influence, resulted in his complete ruin. He lost not only his freedom, but something he valued more, his name. In Texas, a stained name is a life sentence. Life in the valley returned to normal, but something had fundamentally changed. The neighbors, who once looked at Wyatt with disdain, now greeted him with deep respect. They had learned a valuable lesson. Courage had many faces, and the quietest was sometimes the most formidable. The most significant change, however, happened within the Spencer household. One afternoon, while fixing a fence together, Franklin stopped and turned to his son. "I was wrong, Wyatt," he said, the words coming out with difficulty, but with a sincerity that healed the open wound between them. "My pride blinded me. I measured your strength by my ruler and didn't see that yours was greater." Wyatt simply nodded, a small smile forming on his lips. The apology needed no more words. The respect in his gaze was acceptance. They rebuilt not just the fence, but the bridge between two generations, between two worldviews that, together, became stronger. Charlotte became a frequent visitor to the ranch, her intelligence and spirit finding a home alongside Wyatt's calm determination. Together, they represented a new kind of pioneer, one who understood that the future of Texas would be secured not just by strength, but by justice and knowledge. Davy Crockett left the day after the auction, following his own destiny towards history. But his presence left an indelible mark. He didn't save the ranch with a legendary shot, but with an act of integrity, reinforcing the idea that true heroes are not just those who fight, but those who defend what is right, no matter the cost. Wyatt's story and his father's became a sort of local legend, a tale of how wisdom conquered arrogance, a reminder that freedom, hard-won through so much sacrifice, needed to be protected daily, not just on the borders, but in the courts and in the hearts of the people. They never again called Wyatt Kendrick Hughes a coward. They learned that true strength isn't in how fast a man draws his gun, but in how long he endures humiliation to find the truth. In Texas, some heroes carry rifles, others carry maps, and both fight for the same flag. If this story of honor, family, and the fight for the land has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel. Stories like this remind us of universal values. Share this video with everyone who identifies with the pride of defending their roots, whether in Texas or anywhere in the world, including our brothers and sisters who carry the strong Mexican pride. Leave a comment telling us from which city you're watching. We want to know how far these stories of courage are reaching.